Someday Angeline by Sachar. 2. A Goat with Two Heads. Angeline was put in the 6th grade. They put her there because, well, they had to put her somewhere, and they didn't know where else to put her. They put her in Miss Hardlick's class, and that was probably the worst place to be put. She sat at the back of the room. She started to put her thumb in her mouth, but caught herself. She was smart enough for the 6th grade. She was the smartest person in the class, but she did dumb things like suck her thumb. She knew Mrs. Hardlick hated it when she sucked her thumb. 6th graders are not supposed to suck their thumbs. She also cried too much for the 6th grade. Who was Christopher Columbus? Mrs. Hardlick asked the class. Angeline was the only one who raised her hand. Mrs. Hardlick looked annoyed. Somebody else this time? She said and glared at Angeline. It's always the same people. Angeline lowered her hand. It wasn't her fault. She was the only one. She didn't think Mrs. Hardlick should have been mad at her for raising her hand. It was everybody else's fault for not raising theirs. But in her mind, she could hear Mrs. Hardlick saying sarcastically, It's always everybody else's fault, never your own. As she thought this, her thumb slipped into her mouth. Mrs. Hardlick told the class about Columbus. She said that Columbus discovered America. Angeline knew that was wrong. How could Columbus have discovered America when there were already lots of people here? When he arrived, she knew that America was actually first discovered by the first snail to crawl out of the water onto land. It was something she knew before she was born. However, she tried to give both Mrs. Hardlick and Mr. Columbus the benefit of the doubt. Maybe, she thought, from his own point of view, Columbus discovered America. But that didn't seem true either, because even after Columbus got here, he still didn't know he was in America. He thought he was in India, which is why he called Americans Indians. Mrs. Hardlick said that Columbus proved the world was round. Angeline knew that was also wrong. If he had made it to India, then he would have proved it was round, because India was east and he sailed west. But he bumped into America first, and he could have sailed to America even if the world was flat. Besides, everybody knows the world is round before they are born. That is why nobody is even slightly surprised when they first learn it in school. These were the thoughts occupying Angeline's mind when Mrs. Hardlick suddenly called her name. Angeline, she commanded, take your thumb out of your mouth right now. Oops, she thought as she quickly pulled it out. We don't suck our thumbs in the 6th grade, said Mrs. Hardlick proudly. She heard some of the other 6th graders snicker. Mrs. Hardlick resented Angeline. She didn't like having an 8-year-old kid in her class of 6th graders. She especially didn't like having an 8-year-old kid who was smarter than she, although Mrs. Hardlick would never admit that Angeline was smart. In Mrs. Hardlick's mind, Angeline was a genius, which had nothing to do with being smart. It was more like being a freak, like a goat with 2 heads. Only babies suck their thumbs, said Mrs. Hardlick. Angeline felt ashamed. Even kids in the 3rd grade, her age, didn't suck their thumbs anymore. She felt like she was going to cry. Oh, come on, Angeline, she told herself. Don't start crying, not now. She cried way too much for the 6th grade. She even cried a lot for the 1st grade. Look, she's crying, someone teased. She was not. It wasn't true. But then, as soon as she heard that person say it, then wouldn't you know it, she did start to cry. She may be smart, but she's still a baby, said someone else. She's not smart, she's a freak. Angeline, don't be a crybaby, Mrs. Hardlick admonished her. If you feel you must cry, go outside. You may come back in when you are ready to act like a 6th grader. Still crying, Angeline walked outside. What a freak, she heard someone say. She sat down outside next to the door. She was wrong. Mrs. Hardlick didn't hate it when she sucked her thumb. It was just the opposite. Mrs. Hardlick loved it. The whole class loved it. They loved to put her down. And whether she realized it or not, that was why she cried. It wasn't because they called her a baby or a freak. It was because they enjoyed it so much. She bit the tip of her thumb and sniffled. She felt just like a double-headed goat. And that's the end of chapter 2.